So thank you, Annie, for that amazing introduction. I'm so honored to be here and part of this conference. And so my name is Alice Henderson, and I'm a writer and a wildlife researcher. And I feel very passionately about helping wildlife in every way I can, whether that's writing or collecting data in the field or doing activism. And so a little bit about my background. I started writing when I was really young, actually 6. My dad gave me his old Underwood manual typewriter, so I started writing stories on that, a lot of horror and science fiction and ghost stories and detective stories. And I started submitting actually as a teen, but didn't have a lot of luck and getting published there. And I've always been sort of split down the middle between the sciences and the creative arts. So as an undergrad, I studied both writing and then things like field zoology, biogeography, animal behavior. And I went to graduate school. And again, I sort of split down the middle. I studied mythology and then like climatology and geographic information systems. So a strange mix, but it really worked. I just fell in love with GIS, or geographic information systems, as a great way to map terrain and figure out things like what species could be using a certain habitat. And then after I got my master's, I moved on to San Francisco, where I got a job with George Lucas's company, Lucasfilm. And all this time I was still submitting my fiction. But once I had those Star Wars credits, I wrote some video game material for Star Wars games. Once I had those Star Wars credits, things really started to happen. And so I continued to submit my fiction. And I also wrote 2 TV tie-in novels for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was a blast. Was a great experience. So you can sort of make up whatever you want as long as you're true to the TV show. And then the company that owns it, in that case 20th Century Fox, looks at the manuscript and okays it. So I did that for Buffy. I also did it for the TV show Supernatural. If people have seen that, I wrote a book for that, which was a lot of fun. And then once I had those Buffy credits and the Star Wars credits, I sold my own first novel, my own original novel, as they say, in which I owned the copyright, which was called Voracious, and it's set in Glacier National Park. So that was really my first experience camping and writing at the same time, where I was setting the book. So that was really neat. I was actually camping in Glacier National Park, writing this book, and I just loved it. So finally, like, my wildlife work and my writing were starting to come together. And I really liked that feeling. So the next thing I wrote was a near future trilogy, kind of about, if we continue with business as usual with climate change, what is that future going to look like? And what species will be extinct? And, we've seen, especially in the West, British Columbia, California, these devastating wildfires, like things like that, sea level rise, disastrous storms. So I wrote a trilogy called the Skyfire Saga about that, our future if we continue as we are now. And it's also about, I'm sure you've all noticed this almost vilifying of science lately, or not trusting of science. And I thought, what if we move on in that direction and people stop studying science and only study things like business and economy? And so in my book, in this trilogy, the premise is that a character learns that an asteroid's on a collision course with Earth, but nobody remembers how to stop that. No one has continued to study astrophysics. So she goes on this quest to find this mythical group of people who have held on to science and continue to learn science in the hopes that someone will know how to divert this asteroid. So in addition to writing, I also a wildlife researcher. And I mainly do species presence surveys. So I will go out to a wildlife sanctuary and I place out remote cameras and bioacoustic recorders, and I see what species are using the land. And it's a great non-invasive way to see what wildlife is there, because I can place out these cameras and recorders and then withdraw. And that allows wildlife to resume their regular habits without humans around. So I set out these recorders, and they're really neat because I have an audible mic for birds and wolves and amphibians. And then I have an ultrasonic mic, which can record bats, which is like my jam. I love bats. So I'll be able to see by looking at these recordings what bat species are there, what bird and amphibian species, and so on. So it was actually while I was out in Montana doing a survey, and I was setting up remote cameras in the hopes of capturing wolves and some wolverines, maybe even, that I realized, why aren't I writing about this? Why aren't I specifically writing about this wildlife research? And these research projects take me in these really remote, isolated locations, which are perfect for suspense and action. And I thought I should create a series of books about a wildlife biologist who travels to different places to help endangered species. And each book could be about a different species. So that's really when the wildlife work and the writing really came together. And I went back to camp that night and I plotted out the first book. So I thought, if it's okay with everyone, I would have a little brief presentation about the kind of species I've talked about and how I go about addressing these conservation issues and shedding light on these species that are imperiled. So first I want to say that, I thought about writing a nonfiction book or a series of nonfiction books, but it occurred to me that the only people that might pick those up would be people that say were already familiar with, say, the plight of the wolverine and already had a good idea about it. And I thought, well, if I wrote fiction, maybe people would pick it up for the story and then learn about the species on the side. And so I decided I would just write a thriller series because that's what I love to read. And I thought maybe people will pick this book up for the action and the suspense, and then they'll learn about these species on the side. And so there's some challenges with this I found as soon as I dove in. One is you really want to have accurate science in your fiction. So I had the absolute pleasure of attending this writing program called Launchpad, which was funded in part by NASA. And they picked 12 writers, and they put you up at the University of Wyoming. And for the whole week, you just learn all about using accurate science in fiction. Like we learned what really happens if you're sucked out of an airlock and how to calculate a slingshot maneuver or escape velocity. It was really neat. And at night, we looked through these huge telescopes. Unless it was cloudy, then we would talk about bad science fiction movies. But it was a great experience. And so I brought that idea of, I really want this science to be accurate in this fiction. So when I write a book, I use my own research, but I also reach out to experts in the field. And just to be sure I get all the little minutiae right of, like, say, tranquilizing wildlife or attaching remote cameras to them and things like that. Another challenge with this is making the science interesting and digestible. You don't want like a lot of dry facts bogging down the narrative. So taking these facts and making them very engaging and incorporating them into the flow of the narrative, especially with a thriller, which has a lot of action and suspense. You don't want to be on the edge of your seat and then have this long diatribe on, the digestion of wolverines or something. So that I found was a real challenge. And also balancing all of these science facts with the pacing so that one wasn't overwhelming the other. And perhaps the biggest challenge for me has been accurately representing the plight of these species, which can be very depressing, with a message of hope, because people don't want to read a book and get super depressed. They want to feel inspired and hopefully inspired to act is my hope. Be that volunteering in the field maybe, or writing their representative in the government. So I have a little PowerPoint here about the different species I've talked about. If I can share my screen here. Okay, so my first novel that I wrote about this wildlife biologist was A Solitude of Wolverines. And I chose wolverines because down here in the States, we have fewer than 300 left, and they have no federal protection. And so I really wanted to address their plight. So in this book, my character, Alex Carter, is the wildlife biologist, and she's tasked with seeing if any wolverines are using a wildlife sanctuary in this remote part of Montana. And after placing out remote cameras and traversing the sanctuary on foot, she realizes too late that she's seen too much and that she's stumbled onto this far-reaching illegal operation, and she has to stay one step ahead, using everything she knows about the natural world and what it takes to win the battle for survival. So, as I mentioned before, there's these dire facts involved with these species. And you want to balance that with hope. And you want to have cool facts about the species to like inspire people and engage people. So some cool stuff about wolverines and some sad stuff. They only weigh an average of 35 pounds, but they've been known to fight grizzlies off of kills, and they can take down moose. Their historical range here in the States used to extend all the way to New Mexico and as far east as the Great Lakes. And now they're just in these tiny little pockets of the Cascades and the Rockies. Although we have had two actually come down here to California in recent years. But unfortunately, they were both males, and they came down and were unable to find a mate. One lived here in Lake Tahoe for 10 years. So, and they know he came down from the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. So that's quite a trek. As I said, there's only 300 maybe in the lower 48. And they're imperiled for a number of reasons. Climate change, because the females need to den in deep snow to raise their kits. And habitat fragmentation, like the one that came down from Idaho, he would have had to traverse interstates and housing developments and all kinds of dangerous terrain. And then winter recreation in their sensitive areas can disrupt them. And they've been over-trapped and over-hunted to this devastating point. And one bad thing about trapping is it's sort of indiscriminate. You know, even if you're not supposed to catch a wolverine and you're setting it for a coyote or a bobcat, you could still, incidentally capture a wolverine. So some cool facts: wolverines are incredible climbers, and researchers in Glacier National Park once witnessed a wolverine climbing nearly 5,000 feet of the vertical side of Mount Cleveland in only 90 minutes. So something that would have taken human climbers like technical equipment and many, many hours, if not days, to accomplish. And there was a wolverine at a rescue rehabilitation center who would break up pieces of wood and place them in a pattern in this chain link fence. And then he'd take all the wood down and do a different pattern. So he was an artist wolverine, if you will. Parents, both parents of wolverines will take turns raising their kits, which is really neat. So the female will den with the kits, and when they emerge, she starts showing them around the forest. But then the dad will show up, and he'll show them around the forest. In fact, one female wolverine was having trouble. She had grown up, but she was having trouble finding food. And researchers tracked her radio collar and her dad's radio collar, and he showed up and helped her again after she was grown up and showed her around the forest again, because she was raiding things like the researchers' live traps for food. And so he helped her out, which is really neat. They have huge ranges, which is why connecting these habitats is so important. A male wolverine can range 400 square miles, and a female 200 square miles. In fact, one wolverine that researchers collared in Grand Tetons, M56, traveled from the Tetons to Colorado and then all the way up to North Dakota. So they're really neat. My next book, A Blizzard of Polar Bears, of course, I wanted to again pick a species that's in peril. And we can certainly say that about the polar bear. And this one takes place in the Canadian Arctic on the western Hudson Bay with that polar bear population. And in this one, Alex Carter, my wildlife biologist, she ventures out to Hudson Bay to research that polar bear population, but someone doesn't want the study to go through. And Alex's team is beset by threats and sabotage, and ultimately ends up stranded out on the ice in a fight for their lives. The polar bears, they are endangered because they, in part, they face a lot of different threats. But one is that they need to fatten up over the winter by catching seals from that pack ice. So they wait out on the pack ice, and when seals come up, especially by a breathing hole that seals are using, they'll wait and ambush the seals as they emerge. So they use the sea ice as a hunting platform. But because of climate change, the sea ice is forming later each year and breaking up earlier, which shortens this length of time they have to fatten up on seals. And they actually fast during the summer. So the less ice, as it's breaking up so much sooner, that means they're fasting for much longer during the summer, for months. They also face threats from environmental pollutants, PCBs, persistent organic pollutants, and heavy metals like mercury. You're probably all familiar with the process of biomagnification, where, say, if plankton imbibes something like mercury, and then the fish eat the plankton, then the fish has an even more concentrated amount. And then if a seal eats that fish, it's an even more concentrated amount of mercury. And then if the polar bear then eats the seal, you really get an intense amount of pollutants in the polar bear's body. And sadly, researchers have estimated that all 19 subpopulations of polar bears could be gone by the turn of the next century. So they're not doing well. Some neat facts about polar bears. Unlike grizzly bears, who will mark their territory and their scent by rubbing on trees, polar bears obviously have no trees out on the pack ice, so they actually leave a scent trail with their paws. And this will allow, like, say, a female polar bear, if she has cubs, it'll allow her to avoid a male that might kill her cubs. Or if it's a male and he smells a female he likes, that scent trail will allow him to find her out on the ice. And they have the huge ranges. I mean, they can range as much as 4,500 miles in a single season out on the ice. So really impressive amount of walking. And they can swim for really long distances. A swim of 30 miles wouldn't be uncommon. Although now with climate change, some polar bears have been forced to swim depressingly long distances. In one case, a female lost her cub and 22% of her body fat trying to swim. So it can be really dangerous for them. And this is a neat thing, because of the moving pack ice, a female that dens out on the ice with her cubs could emerge from hibernation, many, many miles away from where she originally went in. And it's really interesting that researchers aren't quite sure how they navigate. But they can find the same spot, the same long location year to year, even with the moving pack ice. So it's really interesting. My next book was A Ghost of Caribou, which Annie mentioned in the introduction. I'm really fascinated with mountain caribou. And we actually lost our last two in 2019 from the lower 48. Canada rescued them. Thank you. And so I really wanted to address their plight. So in this book, Alex Carter, the wildlife biologist, is tasked with finding this elusive mountain caribou on a remote wildlife sanctuary in Washington state. And if a caribou has wandered down from British Columbia, it would be huge. So she wants to find this caribou and see if it's there. But when a forest ranger is murdered and Alex learns of a missing backcountry hiker, she finds herself in a fight for survival in the dense groves of ancient trees. and it's set in the inland temperate rainforest, right on the Washington, D.C. border. So mountain caribou, as most of you know, I'm sure, are different from barren ground caribou who roam in Alaska and the Canadian Arctic. Mountain caribou live in steep mountainous terrain, and they rely on deep snowpack in the winter to reach this tree-hanging lichen that they survive on. And it's amazing because lichen has so little nutritive value, but the caribou can survive on it. So they really have their own little ecological niche. Unfortunately, they are at risk due to climate change because the snowpack isn't as deep, so they can't reach those high lichen. The clear cutting of old growth forests has been had a huge impact on them. Habitat fragmentation and winter recreation in their sensitive areas, snowmobilers. They've also been facing unprecedented predation by wolves, and this is because of human activity. As old growth forests are clear cut, these new younger forests take over. And with these new younger forests come deer and elk and moose, which is the wolves' preferred prey. And normally they wouldn't be predating on mountain caribou because of this steep terrain. And so wolves actually, they have a predator-prey relationship with deer and moose and elk, wherein if they eat a lot of, say, deer, the deer population goes down, but that makes the wolf population go down. And then the deer population rebounds, so the wolf population rebounds. Unfortunately, they don't have this relationship with caribou. So they predate on the caribou, the population drops, but that doesn't affect the wolf population, which has that relationship, as I said, with deer and moose and elk. And also wolves have unprecedented access to mountain caribou because of snowmobile trails and logging roads. So it's really taken a toll on them. And as I said before, we lost our last two in 2019, despite the fact that they are actually listed on the Endangered Species Act here in the States. They're also on the Species at Risk Act in Canada. Some cool mountain caribou facts. Their eyes will change color over the course of the year. Like in the summer, they have this deep golden brown that helps reflect back the sun's rays. But in winter, they turn this beautiful deep blue, which helps them see better and drink in more light during the long, dark winters. And they also can see an ultraviolet spectrum, unlike us, which also allows them to navigate in the dark. And another reason they're very different, and one reason why they're so precarious, is unlike barren ground caribou, which can have members in the hundreds of thousands, mountain caribou tend to only have like 50 or so in a herd. So, for example, in Banff National Park, there was a very small herd left, and they were just a handful. They were all killed by a single avalanche. And so that was the last of Banff's mountain caribou. And then finally, the book I just finished, which is not yet titled and does not yet have a cover, is about jaguars. Again, I wanted to pick something that was incredibly imperiled. And you can certainly say that about the jaguar. In this book, Alex Carter is tasked with finding out if jaguars are using a wildlife sanctuary in New Mexico. But not everyone is happy about her being there and reclaiming. They don't want the jaguars to reclaim their historical habitat, and they're determined to end Alex's study. Jaguars used to roam and have a much bigger range in the United States. They lived in California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. Some British colonists reported seeing them in Appalachia, which is amazing. And early colonists saw them in all over the East, North Carolina, Kentucky, Ohio. So they had a much larger range originally. Unfortunately, they've been hunted to near extinction in the US, and there's less than a handful left. that are crossing the border with Mexico. And that is greatly impacted by the border wall, especially the impenetrable 30-foot tall steel pedestrian kind of obstructions. But there's one jaguar named El Jefe, which was captured on some remote cameras, and he's really like captured the attention of people in the American Southwest that have totally embraced him and are gotten them excited about a jaguar returning to the U.S. And some neat things about jaguars, a lot of people associate them with the jungle and don't think of them as living up here, but they're highly adaptable and they'll live in pine forests, deserts, grasslands, swamps, even beaches. They actually love to swim, unlike a lot of other big cats, and will sometimes even catch prey by swimming. They're the third largest of the big cats, second only to lions and tigers. And their bite is the strongest of all the big cats. They have a bigger jawbone that allows room for more muscles because they have fewer teeth. And they are incredibly smart. Of all the big cats, they've got the biggest body to brain ratio. So these are the species that I have been concentrating on in my books. And I've just been so delighted to be able to bring attention to the plight of these species. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Or I was going to talk about the importance of creating a strong female character in this genre, something that's not too common.
I just wanted to tell my little story about caribou.
Oh, please.
So after I bumped into Alice in the and the Wolverine story, of course, I went through the next two and was reading the caribou book as soon as it came out. And in it, she mentions the West Moberly First Nations maternal penning program, which I'm familiar with because I've worked quite a bit with West Moberly and had, heard all about the government telling them they couldn't do it. And as the chief once said to me, we just said, and this is not the word he used, but we said, screw the government, we're going to do it anyway. And so they went ahead, and the people, Roland, the chief, and the elder have been actively involved in this on it. And so there was this little piece that I bumped across and it's talking about West Moberly and going, I know this program, I know these people. So I direct messaged Roland and said, guess what? You and your program are in a novel. And he just went, really? This is so exciting. We've never been in a novel before. So I actually sent him a copy of the book. And the next thing I see on Facebook is Roland holding this book, pointing at the West Moberly reference, at which point I knew I had to get Alice and Roland and Diane and Libby in a room metaphorically together, because it was just such an interesting connection for me. So that's my story. Margaret, did you have your hand up?
I was so honored you did that. Thank you. I see that Margaret had a question. Did someone have their hand up?
There is a question in the chat.
When you finish a book with a certain species, how do you continue to advocate for them as they keep adding up? So true. And you can only concentrate on so many things at once. You have nailed my struggle in life with this question, Margaret. One great thing about this series is it's allowed me a platform like this, which I wasn't really expecting, where I could talk about these species in podcasts and interviews and articles. And so I feel like in addition to the books themselves, I've been able to boost the signal for these species. And also in the back of all of my books, I have a list of resources that people can go to if they want to support nonprofits that do this kind of research, or if they want to volunteer and go out in the field, track wolverines in the snow in the winter, or there's programs for the caribou where they collect lichen to help with supplemental feeding during the winter. So it is a struggle, Margaret. I want to do more. I feel like I constantly feel like I need to do more. and picking like the next species that I'm going to write about, but then I'm also holding all these other ones in my mind and still trying to be active on those and help with those. So it is a challenge. And I hope that people will, when they read these books, will fall in love with these animals and join me in this a fight to help them, be it speaking up or going to community meetings or writing their representatives or donating money to nonprofits, just anything they can think of. We need help. These species need help.
Please put your hand up or put a question in the chat, because I could occupy the poor woman for the rest of the evening. But somebody get in there ahead of me.
So if no one has a question right now, I wanted to talk about creating a strong female character, especially given this conference. So I read a lot of science thrillers, and I have to say, they're very disappointing, a lot of them, when it comes to the depiction of women. And when I created my character, Alex Carter, I knew I wanted a super strong female character who was resourceful. I wanted her to be able to tinker, fix machinery. She knows the martial art Jeet Kune Do. And she isn't defined by her romantic relationships. Because what I noticed reading these science thrillers, it was so discouraging, is you'll have a huge science team, right? And there might be one or two female characters. And most of the time, they're there to hook up with the male characters. So they're either already be in a relationship with the man, or they're going to hook up with him over the course of the book. And frequently, they're described first and foremost as their appearance and their attractiveness, rather than what they're contributing to the science team. So that really discouraged me. And this makes me laugh, but the scenes from their point of view, if there even is a scene from the female point of view in many of these science thrillers, they are laughable. Like, I read one where a woman was running from these assassins in a jungle. They're like shooting at her. She's racing along, and she's thinking, I love these new shorts I got. They really accentuate my butt and long legs. You would not be thinking that while you're running for your life. Another one, this has a cop in it. She's in her 30s, and she is obsessing about her period. Now, you just get your period, the end, she's a cop. She's supposed to be investigating a crime scene, and instead she's just upset. Oh my gosh, I'm getting my period. Oh no, I need some ibuprofen. I mean, and it was just this like on and on and on, in a very unrealistic way. And then another one, a woman was making out with her boyfriend in a car, and these guys show up and they drag the man out, and they're beating him up, like possibly to death. And she's putting on her bra, and there's this really long scene where she's thinking about how shapely her breasts are and how firm and full they are as she's putting this bra on, which takes forever. Meanwhile, her boyfriend's getting killed. It's just so unrealistic. So, I would read these and just think, oh my gosh, we need more strong female characters who are scientists and treated as scientists and treated with respect for their profession. And what is discussed about them isn't just how they look and how attractive they are to the lead character, but the lead male character, but their contributions to the novel and their scientific contributions. And that's why when I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I can't be the only one out here who just wants to read a book with a strong female that's not being objectified here, and who has meaningful things to say and can take care of herself. And so that was my inspiration behind creating my Alex Carter character.
I love that, because thinking about it, I can think of very little description about Alex, whereas in other novels, as you say, there'd be long, boring descriptions of shape and hair and length and, rear ends and shorts and things like that. So, whereas Alex is clearly human and female, and that's what we need to know, besides a stellar scientist. So Jason has put a question in the chat. What other species do you have planned as subjects for upcoming books in the series?
There's so many that I want to talk about. sea turtles, which are imperiled all across the globe. And I'd love to talk about, well, there's so many neat species that, like the American pika, that is imperiled, and bats. I would love to write one about bats. So there's just a ton that I'd like to write about. There's also, I wanted just to add about the females in science thrillers. There's also this sort of idea that a woman can't write a science thriller. It's like, I've encountered this prejudice where people think, oh, you must be writing cozy mysteries. If you all aren't familiar with that term, it's like the little, they tend to not have a lot of action. It's usually a smaller cast of characters in a little English village, perhaps. Think Murder, She Wrote. And or like romance. I get that a lot. Oh, you're a writer, you must write romance. So there's also this prejudice, not just against women in the books, but women who write the books.
Looks like you're a big fan of sea turtles.
Yeah, that's I would love to write that. And there's so many endangered sea turtle species too. I mean, do you pick Ridleys? Do you pick green sea turtles? Do you pick loggerheads? I mean, that's a whole other thing I would love to dive into.
Yeah, my co-organizer Zoe Miletus does a lot of research on tourism and turtles and conservation. So she's going to be very excited if you actually write the sea turtles. Margaret asks, do you have a special process for coming up with your collective nouns?
I do, and thank you for asking that. I meant to say that for my weird titles. Originally, I wanted the books to be the group name of the animal and an animal. But I found when I wrote Wolverines that there is no group name for a Wolverine because they're so solitary. So I had to make one up. So I decided on a solitude of Wolverines. And then with polar bears, once again, there's no word for specifically polar bears. There's a group word for bears, a mall of bears. So I made one up there too, a blizzard. And then with mountain caribou, again, there's a group name for deer, but not specifically mountain caribou. And because mountain caribou are so elusive, they're sometimes referred to as the gray ghost of the forest. So I decided on a ghost of caribou, which I also thought played into the fact that America dropped the ball on protecting them, and now we don't have them down here in the lower 48 anymore. So the ghost of what was. And then ironically, my next book, Jaguars, the working title was A Prowl of Jaguars, which is actually what jaguars are called. But now my publisher wants to rename the book. So alas, I was finally going to have a real group name. So we have to come up with something else.
So I'm just curious, somebody else is asking, how did a biologist jump to writing to working on science fiction movies and then to writing Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Supernatural, both of which I love as good shows, but it seems a big jump from biologist to Buffy Vampire Slayer?
It is, and in some ways I want to blame my parents. Growing up, they loved to scare me. Like my mother, she excelled in terrifying me as a kid. And so I grew up, I think, just loving horror and being scared. And so I gravitated toward that genre. And originally, that's all those years I was submitting and not getting published. It was horror I was writing. And once I started going to conferences and directly meeting editors and things, I realized that community was not very open to women back then. I hope it's better now. It's tough. That's another genre that, women can't write horror, women can't write scary stuff. But so I think that's it. I grew up loving being scared, and horror was one of those things I gravitated toward. My mom, ironically, would tell me, why can't you write anything nice? It's like, what? Maybe because you spent my youth terrifying me. For instance, she would do this thing where I lived in an old turn of the century 2-story house, and we'd all go up to bed about the same time, my parents to read and my sister and I to go to sleep. And my mom would say, my dad and my sister would go upstairs, and my mom would say, Alice, why don't you go up the stairs and I'll turn the light off when you're at the top of the stairs? And I would say, okay, thanks, Mom. I'd get about halfway across the kitchen floor and she'd turn the light off. And I would be plunged into darkness and she'd start snarling and she would say, where, Mommy? And there was just that little chance that maybe she had turned into a werewolf in the dark. So I would run up the stairs and she would slash at my calves all the way up the stairs. This is the person who asks me why I can't write anything nice.
And we're grateful Child Services was not called because you produce such wonderful fiction. So I know there are some writers or want to be writers in the audience, and you've come up from biology to writing. Some of them are coming from writing or humanities into conservation. How do you think people can get started pursuing this sort of thing today? There's obviously a huge demand for conservation and good science, and I applaud the idea of fiction as a route in, because we get so much nonfiction that I think just goes right through and doesn't touch base on its way through. Fiction catches you. But how do you suggest people think about getting started if this is what they want to do?
Absolutely. So in general, just some helpful tips if you're a writer and maybe you're just now working on your first novel, or you're just having trouble becoming persistent about it. I would say, like, there's a couple little tricks I use. Like if you're feeling like you can't write, like, oh, I want to write, but I'm just not feeling inspired or whatever. Tell yourself you're just going to sit down and write 50 words. That's it, just 50 words. And chances are, once you write those 50 words, you're going to write a lot more. And so that kind of just breaks that barrier that you can get into. Another trick is, if you sit down and write, leave your sentence off in the middle of a sentence. So the next time you sit down to write, you'll be tempted to finish that sentence, and then you'll probably keep writing. And then there's this James Thurber quote I love: "Don't get it right, get it written." Some people just agonize over their drafts and every single word choice. And I find you just go ahead and write it. You can always fix it later. Even if you're writing something, you're just hating it, hating what's coming out, just think, that's okay. I can just fix this later. It's all fixable. And you're going to do many drafts before you submit. So it's all fixable. And then if you've already written something and you're struggling with getting published, here's some things that I wish I had known when I was just starting out. One is attend conferences. Meeting editors and agents in person can make a huge difference, because normally if you submit to a book publisher or magazine, it goes into the dreaded slush pile that's just going to sit there forever until some overworked assistant finally looks at it. It's just terrible. But if you directly pitch to an editor or agent, then say, hey, I want to send you this, then it'll go straight to their desk when you send it in. So that's huge help. And also meeting other writers at these conferences, because they'll know who's a good editor to approach or who's a bad editor to approach. And just the camaraderie is so powerful. Just to know someone else is struggling along with this crazy career too, can just be a huge buoying help. And to that end, with conservation, if people are interested in working that into their fiction, there's all kinds of neat conferences. The Wildlife Society has a conference every year that travels around, and going there and just listening to the talks and meeting these researchers just opens up a whole world of neat subjects you can write about, and species that are imperiled that maybe you weren't as familiar with, their plight. And it can just be very inspiring, making those connections, and being around kindred spirits can really help.
There is a question. You have a degree in creative writing as well as biology?
Both of my degrees are weird, interdisciplinary. degrees. My undergrad is in creative writing. Actually, writing as a profession was the technical term, and then zoology. So they're all mixed up. And then my graduate degree is an interdisciplinary degree in folklore and geography, so geographic information systems. And then I have a postgraduate. I'm certified in geographic information systems and remote sensing. And then my bioacoustic studies were through the Arizona Department of Fish and Game. So I'm kind of all over the place.
I would think being a writer requires picking up a lot of weird, interesting knowledge. Degrees are one way to do that, and also so is experience. So as an interdisciplinarian, I salute you.
Yay.
As well. Why do you think fiction does do better than just non-fictional statements of you should? Oh, excuse me, Jasleen has her hand up. Jasleen, please ask.
Hi, I just wanted to ask what's the kind of headspace do you have to uh, be in to do your research? What's your ritual to get into that kind of headspace to write before? As there's so many young writers in our group right now, they would obviously feel very inspired if you share your routine.
Well, one thing I want to say about writing is, I don't know about you, but I was discouraged a lot when I was younger about writing. Oh, you'll never make it, or get a real job, and that sort of thing. And I would tell myself, I'd walk into a bookstore and I'd see all of these books, and I would think, well, who wrote these books? People like me. These books have been published. Could I get published? Yes. If these books can get published. And to all those naysayers, I just wanted to say, who do you think wrote all these books? Like magical elves? I mean, it's real people writing. And so part of it is putting any naysayers, just ignore them. You can absolutely write and you can get published. And it's very doable, and it's a craft that you hone. So I would say my routine is, especially if I'm submitting my fiction, I don't let rejections get me down. And I know that's a tall order and they still bum you out, but if I've sent some stories out, say, and I get a rejection, I'll immediately send more out, or I'll have a bunch out at the same time. So if I do get a rejection, I'll know, oh, I still have these others out. And as far as writing goes, I really absolutely believe persistence is the most important quality you can have. If you stick with your writing and you believe in your writing and you write, and you don't have to write every day, or I think it's key to find what works for you. I used to try to imitate other writers, like Jack London, for example, apparently wrote 1,000 words a day. So I was like, well, I'll try that. I'll write 1,000 words a day. Or, I'd hear about how Dinar Kuntz writes, and I'd try that. And nothing really quite clicked. And I found what personally worked for me is I have a little portable word processor called an AlphaSmart, just runs on 3 AA batteries. And I write in the dark. So I'll be in my sleeping bag or my bed or whatever. I'll shut the light off and I'll write in the pitch black. And there's something about that I can really steep myself in the setting with the characters, and something about sensory deprivation. So that was my weird little thing I finally found worked. So I'd say whatever works for you, even if it's weird, embrace that and do that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. That answers my question. And thank you for coming here. It's so inspiring to see a writer in person, but virtually, to talk to us, share their experiences, because we, like yourself, I do visit a lot of bookstores and I see these big names and so many heavy books. And that's very intimidating to see that. And but it's very nice to see a realer experience and get in person touch.
Well, thank you for coming. And I would also say, when you see all those books, and especially the big names that get all the attention and the advertising space and everything, and you're like, tons of writers make a living writing, and maybe they're not James Patterson multimillionaires, but the cool thing is, if you're an accountant, you can always guess what your income's going to be like for the rest of your life. But if you're a writer, there's that chance, that you're going to take off, and then you'll have millions of dollars to buy connected lands to help wildlife or whatever your dream is. So yeah, just keep writing and believe in yourself, and just shut out those naysayers, because you can do it.
Sarah, you get the last question.
All right. Okay. You see me?
Mm-mm.
No, you can hear me?
We can hear you though.
Okay. I didn't know how to put the video on. Well, sorry. So thank you so much, Alice, for walking us through the writing process and all that. I have two questions actually, and you can just briefly answer. One is that the writer's block is one major thing, because I also want to write, and I try to write at sometimes, but there's a block, the writer's block that we say. How do we deal with that? And what do you think is the scope of online books for writers who are like Kindle, where you can post your book? It's a free space. So how is that emerging in the writing field? How could that help us, like emerging writers?
The writer's block can be tough. And I find that talking to my fellow writers, it's very individual. If you can figure out what's blocking you, like, is it a fear of failure? Is it a fear of success? Is it you have negative people in your life telling you can't pull it off? Is it just a problem with starting to write, just making yourself sit down and write? And one thing that might help, that's helped me, is find out if you're a seat of the pants writer or a writer that likes to outline. Because sometimes you may sit down and think, well, I don't know where to go in my story now, or I feel kind of lost or blocked. Or if you can outline out your story and then make a commitment that you're going to show up every day or every other day or whatever feels right to you, and add to that story, and tell yourself, well, I could watch TV, or I could tell myself a story. Maybe I want to tell myself a story. And only you can bring that unique vision to the story. Only you can tell that story the way you want to tell it. So you have something to contribute, and that's inspiring. And try those little tricks that I mentioned earlier, like, say if you're feeling like, oh, I just can't write, I just feel blocked, just say, I'm going to write 10 words or 20 words, and see if that opens up a door for you. And try little tricks like that, and find out what makes you write, what inspires you. And also talking to other writers, that could help. They're struggling too, probably. We all do. And finding out how they're getting past these blocks. As far as the online question is, a lot of writers are finding success with that, publishing directly to Kindle. It used to be that self-publishing was frowned upon, and you probably would have a hard time getting a traditional publisher to publish you if you'd first gone self-publishing. But that's not true anymore. A lot of my writer friends are having great success. Say they had a series going and the publisher canceled it. They've just continued the series on Kindle and had a lot of success. And just directly starting in Kindle, a lot of writers are making their living doing that. So that's a great way to go if you don't want to do the traditional route.
Thank you very much. I really liked how you described the writer's block is something to do with your experience or something that's going on with you. So thank you very much. That really resonated with me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope it helped. I know writer's block is not fun, but you can do it.
It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for coming.
So we are out of time, but I'd like everybody to sort of join me in thanking Alice for coming and sharing on Thanksgiving, for which I apologize.